Humanity has always looked to the stars. From our earliest beginnings and all the way into the modern day. It showed up in books and films. The ability to somehow, some way, make it up there. Be it a Baltimore space gun or something a little bit more practical. It was the Germans in the 1940s who were the first to actually put an object into space. When they launched V2 rockets towards London, these devices would reach lower orbit before coming back down and hitting their targets. Of course, the creators of such technology, such as Wernher von Braun, would later be taken in Operation Paperclip by the United States to help them in what was starting to become an arms race with the Soviet Union, or as we would call it, the Cold War. Now, the first act of this Cold War, or at least the space element of this Cold War, has often been argued as this: when the Soviets put Sputnik into orbit, and it just sort of sat there menacingly, just beeping. It didn't really do much except send out a radio signal, but it was something in space, and it terrified the Americans. If they could put this into space, does that mean they own space? Does that mean the space is going to be communist? Can't have that now, can we? Thought the Americans. But there Sputnik was, floating around, not really doing anything, just being communist and beeping loudly, incessantly. And so, like I said, this was absolutely terrifying to the average American. They put a thing in space. Does this mean they could put missiles in there next? Could they land on the moon, perhaps? Put nukes there? Targeting the US from a place that we could not fight back? And so, they started NASA. The National Agency, the National Aeronautic and Space Agency. Oh no, it's the North American Space. I always forget. So, they start NASA to try to compete with the Soviets' efforts at space exploration. So, they were started by putting monkeys into space. The Soviets, on the other hand, tried a different tactic and put Laika into space. Then she exploded. Both sides continued doing their things, the event of space chimps happened, and then we get to the 1960s, where, looking at the US putting their monkeys into space, the Soviets decide to one-up them and put a hairless monkey in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first man into space. And for the Americans, you can see how this looks.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
So, this was, once again, absolutely terrifying. Now the Soviets had a massive edge on them. Not only had they put the first object in space, they'd put the first human. Not to be deterred, the Americans followed up with their own project, Project Mercury, which began with these small canister-like space modules to be launched by rocket into space and then come back down. And so, let's see what we got next. Oh, it's a Smash meme. Well, here we have it. Alan Shepard, the first American to be put into space. So let's see those tallies now, shall we? I don't know if it really counts for America, but hey, they put someone in space, I guess. Even if the USSR has already beat them to that and put the first object in space, I guess they can have a point. But, well, okay. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the incident. So, US space program has been going fairly decently, and here we have Gus Grissom, one of the first American astronauts, right next to his ship, the Liberty Bell. She has put a lovely decal on there. This is one of the first objects by America to go into space, and most of it goes off well. It goes into orbit, spins around the Earth a little bit, and then they bring it back down. It lands in the water, but here's where things don't go as planned. The US, of course, went to recover the module and, of course, Grissom. But what happened was the automatic hatch that is supposed to eject itself off did so early, allowing water to start flooding into the module. Grissom was able to climb out and struggle around in the water due to his heavy spacesuit, but his module began to sink. A helicopter arrived at scene. Marines went into the water to help Grissom, while the helicopter itself tried to pull up the module, but at this point, it was so inundated with water, it began to drag the helicopter down with it. Eventually, they severed the line and allowed the Liberty Bell to sink to the bottom of the ocean, sharing a fate with the Titanic. Grissom would be brought from the water, as would, almost 50, 60 years later, the Liberty Bell itself, which is now on display, I believe, the Kennedy Space Center. However, Grissom's story does not end there. In fact, it ends rather tragically with a fire that that was aboard Apollo 1. So, the US can kinda have a point, I guess. So, if you're the United States at this point, you're thinking to yourself, okay, we've had a few false starts, but that's fine. We only burned up a few monkeys and humans. So let's do something big. Something massive. Now, I will also point out, it wasn't just the US that suffered such failures. There was things such as the Voyages incident for the USSR, and even Yuri Gagarin, on his way back into Earth, almost burnt to death. So, like I said, if you're the US right now, you want to do something big. And, well, as Kennedy put it in his inaugural address, we choose to go to the moon. Now, they start off small. They signed the Outer Space Treaty, basically ratifying that no one could put weapons in space or claim space, you know, all that sort of thing. And of course, that brings us to the big thing. It's Apollo 11 time. Let's meet our contestants. We have Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, who no one remembers. It's weird. And so, the Americans were going to do it. After years of training for the pilots, and years of getting the technology just right. The Saturn V rocket was ready. Cape Canaveral in Florida, ready to be launched towards the moon. The Americans were going to do it. They were going to put a man on the moon, and not just any man, a red, white, and blue patriot. And so, they were ready for launch.
Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading. Plus 30 seconds. Roll complete and engine program. One Bravo is a abort control mode. Altitude's 2 miles. Houston, you're good at 1 minute. Downrange 1 mile, altitude 4 miles now. Velocity 2,195 feet per second.
Oh, roll back there. So, after years and years of it just being a possibility, the Americans are finally attempting it. Apollo 11 left Earth orbit and began on its trajectory towards the moon. And I have a little visualization of what I think the landing looked like. This might not be 100% accurate, but I think it's pretty close. And so, with the module now on the moon, it was time to hear one of the most infamous speeches in history. And so, with those words, Neil Armstrong set foot onto the surface of the moon. The Americans had done it. They had put the first humans onto an outer Earth planet. Well, moon. An outer Earth body. And as they planted and saluted the stars and stripes, the news was reverberating around the Earth. The Americans had done the near impossible. did they? This is a joke. Because, as we all know, who got there first? Still a joke. We know it was the Americans. And so, after a few hours of tests, gathering samples, and just overall just having a nice time on the moon and having the existential crisis of seeing the entire planet that you were born on just floating there in the void, they decided it was time to go home. And so the capsule was launched back up into space, where it met up with Colin, who had not actually came down to the surface of the Earth. That was all Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And once all three men were in the same capsule, they started piloting it back towards the Earth, where it did a water landing and was picked up by the USS Hornet. Now, I could do a full video on the USS Hornet at some point, and I really would, but not today. But it was involved in the Doolittle raid in 1942, which is one of the most ballsy moves ever attempted in the history of warfare. So, back to space, well, Earth, but you know what I mean. So, once back on the Hornet, the three men were placed inside a vacuum chamber known as Hornet Plus 3 due to the fear of what they could have brought back with them from the moon. Radiations that we did not have here on Earth, etc., etc. After a few hours, or it might have been days, the three astronauts were getting settled in when they had a presidential visit from Nixon himself, who, as we all know, is going to have a long, good career as president without any sort of controversy. Am I right, guys? Watergate, Schmottergate, what is that? I've never heard of it before. And so the astronauts had a nice talk with Nixon, just bantering back and forth, and, you know, just being happy to be back on Earth and share their experiences with the press on what it was like to be the first men on the moon. Oh god, it's Nixon. Let's leave. And so, once their period of quarantine was over, it was on to the ticker parades, parading through the streets of America, and even going on a world tour, stopping in places such as Belgrade. So, crossing the quasi Iron Curtain of communist Yugoslavia. So, let's look at those W's again. No, you can't claim that. Okay, let's look at it without the American nostalgia goggles, and yeah, that seems a bit more appropriate. I would say that's how the space race ended. And as the USSR ball here says, they tried for a couple of years afterwards to try to draw the Americans at putting men on the moon, but they eventually just decided to say nah, and just, yeah, happily left the Americans to have that W. So let's look at the aftermath. So the 1970s goes through, and there's advances into the space technology, particularly with the creation of the Space Shuttle, and of course, we're now in the 1980s. And so we have things like the ISS now, the International Space Station, which also goes to show that easing of tensions. Oh, it's Sputnik. Yeah, I forgot that's still up here. It hit the ISS. Anyway, so it goes to show that cooperation is beginning to grow now. particularly between the USSR and the USA, in the fact that, well, they were able to build a space station for most everyone. And that brings us to one particularly famous incident. This is Challenger 2. And this is her crew, which includes, for the first time, a civilian, a schoolteacher called Krista McAuliffe. NASA decided that this would be a big opportunity for the US to do, and it wouldn't hurt that it would fly in the face of the USSR and be a bragging right that they put a civilian in space. Krista was supposed to go up with Challenger 2 and go to the International Space Station, where she would perform a lesson for her students back on Earth. And so, let's see how this went.
Power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles most of the flight, 104%.
I'm sorry if you suffer from epilepsy. It is a little bit much.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
The Challenger disaster put an end to the public caring. And very soon, the tragedy of losing Krista McAuliffe and the rest of the Challenger 2 crew was heavy on everyone involved, and was one of the main drives for why the United States cancelled its own space shuttle program. In the intervening years, it has been turned to private companies to take up the slack, and it's not going too well for them. However, there is an upside, as the United States and NASA have once again started a project Artemis. With the hope that once again there will be a small step for man and a giant leap for mankind. So, let's finish with some humor, I guess. This is Big Bird. Isn't this about the space race? Why are you bringing up Sesame Street character? Good point, actually. Well, before Kristen McAuliffe was chosen for Challenger 2, NASA had the idea to put Big Bird in there. Let me reiterate, Big Bird was almost a casualty of one of the biggest space disasters to ever happen. It's a good thing it didn't, because as we all know, Big Bird is a great guy.